Hello, hello. So welcome everyone to our monthly CW Research Lunch and Learn. I think most of you know me. I'm Nicole Presley, the manager of KT Knowledge Translation at the Women's Health Research Institute. I'm really thrilled to introduce our speaker today. But before I do that, I wanted to take just a moment to reflect on the land I'm joining you from, the unceded, ancestral, and occupied territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I myself am an uninvited settler of Italian and Scottish-Irish descent. And as somebody who is connected very much to women's health research. I just wanted to, and my own learning and unlearning journey, I wanted to just bring up an opportunity for folks interested that on May 5th is National Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, Two-Spirit, and Gender Diverse People Awareness Day. And I'll pop a link in the chat in case you're interested in learning more. But there's lots of local events that you can take part in various communities, and there's a lot of resources that we can take part in, myself included, to learn the truth. And so I'll just pop that in for folks to check out. Our speaker today, Oakley. Oakley is the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Manager at the BC Children's Hospital Research Institute, where they work closely to support the integration of more inclusive and intersectional practices into the research done at BC Children's Hospital Research Institute. They're committed to fostering an environment and culture where all identities feel safe, affirmed, and celebrated. Oakley brings over 6 years of experience in anti-racism research, facilitation, policy analysis, and consulting. Their education background includes a Master of Education and Master of Arts in History, and their academic research examined the intersections of race, education, and incarceration, which, coupled with their own lived and work experience, inform their approach to EDI work. Outside of work, Oakley spends most of their time taking their dogs, Harvey and Harlow, who we hope will make an appearance, on adventures, perusing their local record shop, or growing their ever-expanding shoe collection. I'm sure they have great taste in footwear. And you keep your really coveted shoes on a higher shelf. So Oakley, I will pass the mic over to you, and thank you so much. We're so excited for this presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Nicole, for that very kind and funny introduction. I'm really excited to be here with everyone today. I'm grateful to have this space to talk about something that I'm very interested in and passionate about. It's fun to have opportunities in the work context to get to do that, and it feels like not too common experience. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And hopefully that's everyone seeing that all right. Nicole, okay,
it's perfect.
Cool. As Nicole said, my name is Oakley. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Manager for the Children's Hospital Research Institute. And today we are going to be talking about intersectionality, and specifically its role in equity, diversity, and inclusion, but broadly just kind of what it is, a little bit about the history of it, and then hopefully it becomes clear how it's a useful tool in doing impactful EDI work, but also we'll have some conversations about what that can look like. Nicole already did such a wonderful land acknowledgement, but I want to just add a little bit to it only because I think it's important in the context of what we're going to talk about today, and there's a specific connection I want to discuss. So I also live and work in what we colonially call Vancouver, which is situated on the stolen, unceded, unoccupied lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. As we will discuss today, intersectionality as a theoretical framework is something that we are able to utilize because of a lot of labor done by Black women and femmes over the course of the 20th century, Also, though, it would not exist today if it were not for the contributions of Indigenous women and femmes over that same time period, which is something we will also talk about today. So just feels at its kind of root, similar to many other anti-oppressive frameworks, intersectionality is anti-colonial, and it would feel improper to not properly attribute credit to the people who did all of that labor so that we get to use it today. And among those are Indigenous women and femmes who articulated their lived experience in a way that highlighted how existing at intersections is a unique experience. So just wanted to make sure to kind of attribute that credit properly before we move into the content of today's session. So just a very brief kind of agenda or overview of what we're going to talk about. We're first going to define intersectionality, starting with a bit of an activity, then moving into a brief history of the evolution of theory that led to intersectionality. I've mainly highlighted or bolded and underlined brief to remind myself to keep it brief. It's something that I'm very passionate about, so could talk about for a long time, but I know that we have limited time together, so I will endeavor to keep that concise and not too boring. I mean, I find it interesting, but I know for others it might not be. Understanding our own intersectionality, so better kind of identifying our own identities and how different components of our identity may be marginalized or privileged. We'll get into that a little bit more. The last kind of content component will really be differentiating between positionality and identity and how important it is to be able to do that when you want to do impactful EDI work, or just broadly when you want to move through the world not being complicit in harmful structures and systems. And then if I'm able to stay on time, we will have a wrap up where we can ask questions and discuss a little bit, because otherwise the session is very much just me talking at you, which is not my favorite. So I would love to ensure that there is some time to engage in some discussion together. So before we get into, I guess not even before we get into the content, but I want to start with an exercise or activity, maybe is a better word, to kind of introduce us to why intersectionality is such an important lens to view the world through. Two things I want to mention though before we get into this activity. The first is that this was taken directly from a TED Talk done by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who we will talk about a lot throughout this session. She is the one who coined the term intersectionality. This is not my activity, so I just want to make sure to appropriately attribute credit to her, because it's very powerful and not something I came up with by myself. The second is a content warning for anti-Black racism, death, and violence in this particular activity. If that is not something that you have the capacity to engage with today, please feel free to mute and step away from the computer for a little bit, take some space for yourself. This activity will probably be about 5 minutes, so if you want to be away for the duration, that's about how long it'll be. Again, just a content warning for anti-Black racism, death, and violence. So to just offer a little bit of setup for what this is going to look like, there are two boxes on the screen. In each box will appear a list of names that I will also read out. I'm going to go through one list and then the other. When I'm done reading the first list, you don't need to do anything other than just take note of how many of the names you recognize. George Floyd, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Mike Brown, Tamir Rice. So again, you don't need to do anything, just of those 5 names, whether you write it down or just make a mental note, just reflect on how many you recognize. Okay, so we are now going to do the same thing. In that other box on the screen, another list of names will appear. And when I'm done reading them out, I want you to just take note of how many you recognize. Breonna Taylor, Maya Hall, Jazeline Ware, Rakia Boyd, Tanisha Anderson. So again, just take a moment and of these 5 names, make a note of how many you recognize. So if there are some names on either of these lists that you recognize. You may be able to draw a connection between all of these people. They are all Black people in the United States who were killed by police. The first list is all Black men who were killed by police. The second list is all Black cis and trans women who were killed by police. Now, I don't want to be presumptive about how many of the names you knew on either of the lists, but I'll just share a little bit about having run this exercise in the past, in my own experience, as well as observing it in the TED Talk that Kimberly Crenshaw gave. Pretty consistently, there is a discrepancy in the knowledge of names in the first list and the knowledge of the names on the second list, meaning that overwhelmingly people seem to be able to recognize the names of the men who were killed and have less familiarity with the names of the cis and trans women who were killed. So just give this kind of a moment to settle into your body. This activity is meant to be, but is also very heavy, and I can acknowledge that, to have these names displayed in front of you. So if you need to take a moment, please do. So having run this exercise a number of times, it remains to me to be very poignant and demonstrates that existing at particular intersections, particularly when those intersections are increasingly oppressed by societal power structures, is just, no, sorry, let me rephrase that. Sometimes when existing at multiple intersections, particularly when they are increasingly oppressed by societal power structures, means not only is your life more precarious, but it also means that you may not be considered kind of quote unquote palatable enough by the mainstream media to make it to the public radar and to be mourned. When we don't know that tragedy happens, it not only strips us of our ability to grieve, but also to kind of truly understand the pervasiveness of violence. So like I said, when Crenshaw does this exercise, it's very interactive. She has people stand up and then sit down when they no longer recognize the names. And it's just such a stark contrast between the list of men and the list of cis and trans women. And having run this exercise before, I've observed that sometimes people feel, I don't know, maybe shame is too strong of a word, but some level of guilt in the discrepancy of the knowledge of the names in the first list and the knowledge of the names in the second list, which is not the intent of the exercise at all. Instead, what it's meant to do is highlight why a framework like intersectionality is so vital, because none of us are impacted by a singular oppressive system, and those systems compound on one another and create unique oppressive experiences depending on our identities. So pictured here is Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, a very kind of broad overview definition of intersectionality. It's a theoretical framework that was developed by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 in a paper for the University of Chicago Legal Forum titled "Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine, Feminist Theory, and Anti-Racist Politics," to explain how Black women face overlapping marginalization and discrimination related to sexism and racism. This approach, or lens, assists researchers to better understand and address the multiple barriers and disadvantages faced by individuals with intersecting social identities, so socially constructed identities, such as race, gender, sexuality, and class. Using an intersectional approach to develop policies and research projects helps to better identify and address systemic barriers. So Crenshaw coined this term, or highlighted this need for this theoretical framework in 1989, not only as a result of her legal scholarship, but also as a result of her legal practice. So when she no longer practices as much, but when she used to represent Black women clients, they either had to choose to file for discrimination on the basis of race or the basis of gender. Crenshaw felt that when you treated those two things as separate, it was insufficient, because the first did not adequately encompass the experience of being a Black woman due to the operating assumption that Blackness as a category transcends gender or is universal across gender. The same dynamic happened with the category of woman, as it operated under this kind of hidden assumption that woman equals white woman, and this in turn totally sidelined BIPOC women, trans women, and women who exist at any other intersection, really. So And I acknowledge that so far this has been very US focused. I think it's important to describe it in the context within which she came to the idea, and not to just to, yeah, when we are kind of learning it at a foundational level. So there's this really important Supreme Court case in the US that Crenshaw often cites in her work that I like to mention because it's such an overt example of what this looks like in practice. So it was a court case in 1976, DeGraff and Reed versus General Motors, which was a case in which 5 Black women sued General Motors, excuse me, for a seniority policy that they argued targeted Black women exclusively. So before the enactment of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the company didn't hire Black women, meaning that so they started to hire Black women in 1964, not giving them credit for that, they were legally obligated to, meaning that when seniority-based layoffs arrived in the early 1970s during the recession under President Richard Nixon, all of the Black women hired after 1964 were subsequently laid off. So a policy like this didn't fall under just gender or just racial discrimination. They didn't fire or lay off all of the women employed at the company, and they didn't fire or lay off all of the Black people employed at the company, just exclusively the Black women. The court, though, decided that the efforts to bind together both racial discrimination and gender discrimination claims, rather than suing on the basis of each separately, was the word, if I'm remembering correctly, they use in the opinion is that it would be unworkable. What they really meant is they were unwilling to entertain that this was a unique experience. So Crenshaw argues that by treating Black women as purely women or purely Black, the courts, society more broadly, have repeatedly ignored the specific challenges that face Black women as a group. So we're now going to get into, again, the part that I will try to keep brief, which is a little bit of a history on the evolution of theory that led to intersectionality. So you'll see two what are going to become timelines on the screen. The top one is going to be kind of the evolution of thought within academia. The bottom is going to be the evolution of Black and Indigenous women and femmes articulating their unique experiences living at the intersection of oppressive structures, and then coming together with the theory of intersectionality. So the first kind of significant event, for lack of a better word, on this timeline is the emergence of something called critical theory in 1937. So critical theory as a framework existed before 1937, but it wasn't termed that until 1937. At the most basic level, critical theory is a social theory that says that the primary goal of philosophical thought is to understand and to help overcome the social structures through which people are dominated and oppressed. The goal, critical theorists say that the goal of all thought and inquiry, whether that be informal settings like in academic spaces or informal settings just existing in the world, should be the emancipation of people. So it was officially coined, critical theory, by a German Marxist philosopher named Max Horkheimer in 1937. And what this meant was that originally critical theory provided a class-based analysis of the world. So if we fast forward a little bit to the 1950s into the early 1960s, Frantz Fanon publishes 2 books. I mean, he has lots of writings that I would encourage folks to read, but he publishes 2 really significant texts, Black Skin, White Masks in 1952 and The Wretched of the Earth in 1961. So Fanon was a psychologist and theorist from Martinique who wrote during the era of African nations gaining independence. Of course, colonialism didn't leave when Europeans did, so gaining independence is used maybe a little bit loosely. And he wrote through an anti-colonial lens, critiquing the kind of lasting impacts of colonialism on colonized people. He was trained in and called himself a Marxist, so the language that he uses in these texts is very Marxist. However, he makes this big shift that becomes really important, where he asserts that the axes of discrimination upon which the world sits is race and not class. So we fast forward a little bit more, and critical theory starts to kind of have these offshoots into particular fields. For our purposes of our conversation today, the emergence of critical legal studies being this really significant kind of next step. So if you were to try and summarize critical legal studies in one sentence, I guess it would be that law and politics are not separate. Law is not apolitical. It is not purely founded on morals. It has an agenda. So as critical legal studies was very much influenced by critical theory, it has a pretty overt class-based component to it. In particular, it was heavily influenced by this theorist and politician named Antonio Gramsci, who, among many things, is most well known for his ideas around ideology and hegemony. Essentially, that ideologies are used to reinforce dominant views. And in this context, law is an ideology used to reinforce dominant power structures. So many of the people who would become lawyers and at the forefront of critical legal studies were in law school during the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam protests. So it informed their understanding of what law was used as in the world. They argued that these events seem to contradict the assumption that law is fundamentally just and the product of historical progress. Instead, that law seems to heavily favor the wealthy and powerful. So critical legal studies was wonderful, but it was really broad in its analysis. And over the 1980s and into the 1990s, you see more kind of identity-specific iterations of it emerge. So critical race theory emerges in the 1980s, critical queer theory, or more commonly just called queer theory, critical disability studies, all of these things emerge with their roots in critical legal studies. So critical race theory is significant for a number of reasons. It's also a theoretical framework at which Kimberly Crenshaw was at the forefront of. But it also became really foundational for what would later become intersectionality. And then lastly, I have made it my personal mission a little bit to push back against some of the misinformation around what critical race theory is. I know that in this particular moment, the discourse and rhetoric around it is really that it's being taught to young people in K through 12 education. Critical race theory is a legal framework. It's not possible to teach it to people who are not in law school, or at least maybe in the upper years of undergrad. All critical race theory really set out to do was look at, after the enactment of the Civil Rights Act, if on paper people of color and white people were equal, why in practice are people of color and white people not equal? There must be a legal reason. There must be law that exists that exacerbates racial inequities, even if it's not doing it in an overt way. So simultaneously, while there is this evolution of theoretical thought, women and femmes of color are articulating the realities of their lived experiences, highlighting how existing at the intersection of white supremacy and patriarchy results in unique experiences that those who are only really impacted by one of those two systems just can't quite understand. So I've just picked a couple people writings to focus on over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. This is by no means a comprehensive list. But just a couple, I think, really important ones that highlight this evolution. So if we go as far back as 1851, Sojourner Truth delivers her Ain't I a Woman speech. Sojourner Truth was an abolitionist and advocated for women's right to vote in the United States. And in this speech, if you have not read it, I would encourage you to. It's really profound. Essentially, what she's doing is dismantling or deconstructing the concept of chivalry between men and women. So she says things, and this is me paraphrasing, but she says things to the effect of, chivalry dictates that a man hold open the carriage door for a woman. No one's ever held open a carriage door for me. Ain't I a woman? So again, challenging this idea that woman is an experience that transcends, in her context, transcends race. So we move forward a little bit into the 1920s. A very famous Sioux activist named Zakala Sa publishes a series of articles on the unique experience of Indigenous women under colonialism. So she really examined how gender, race, and age shaped women's experiences, and how colonial forces used gender, race, and age to control not only women's bodies, but also land. Fast forward a little bit more into the 1970s, and the Combahee River Collective rises to prominence with works that speak to what they called interlocking oppression, so not so distinct from intersecting. Um, if you are unfamiliar with the Combahee River Collective, they were a group of Black feminists in the 1970s. Who made them up shifted a little bit, but some of the longest tenured members were Cheryl Clark, Gloria Hall, Audre Lorde, Shirlane McCrae, among many. And a lot of their work described how different forms of discrimination were interlocking again. So racism, classism, sexism, they were not only related to one another, but they reinforced one another. Into the 1980s, I mean, they were well known prior to the 1980s, but really this was the time in which they, I think, got the most acclaim. Black feminists like Angela Davis and Bell Hooks published works that highlight the unique oppressive experiences of Black women and femmes. So texts like Angela Davis's Women, Race, and Class, or Women, Culture, and Politics, or Bell Hooks's Ain't I a Woman, or From the Margins to the Center, really highlight like this unique experience of existing at the intersection of, among many, but these two particular oppressive systems. So these two kind of I guess timelines converge in 1989. Crenshaw has kind of a role in both, and she exists in both spaces. She is an activist and advocate, but also trained in academia. And these two things converge in 1989 when she coins the term intersectionality, but really is coining this really kind of complex framework through which she's asking of us to look at the world through. So intersectionality is, it's a theoretical framework, but on an interpersonal level, it's asking of us to really be hyper aware of and understand who we are in the world and what parts of our identity give us power and privilege, and what parts of our identity contribute to our marginality or marginalize us. So in the pursuit of that, I want to spend some time talking about power and privilege. There's a lot of different definitions of power and privilege within EDI or DEI or JEDI or anti-oppressive spaces. I've picked two for today. These are things that we could talk about afterwards. You might have your own definitions. These are by no means the only definitions, just two that I think will help advance our conversation. So power is the ability or official authority to decide what is best for others, that kind of paternalism idea. The ability to decide who will have access to resources, the capacity to exercise control over others. Privilege is unearned access to resources only readily available to some people as a result of their advantaged identity group membership. Privilege operates on personal, interpersonal, cultural, and institutional levels and gives advantages, favors, and benefits to members of dominant groups at the expense of members of marginalized groups. Having systemic privileges makes us ignorant to others' lived and living experiences. When we say systemic privilege, we mean those whose identities have been and continue to be centered in society. So that's white people, cisgender men, cisgender people broadly, people who identify as straight, people who are neurotypical or don't live with disabilities, etc. And this is opposed to those who historically and today are marginalized in society. So BIPOC, women, trans and non-binary folks, those who do not identify as straight, neurodivergent people, and those living with disabilities. So to help us better understand the kind of everyday implications of our identity, I want to do another exercise. Again, this is just introspective. It's not going to require you to, to talk or share. You've probably seen some version of this identity wheel in a lot of EDI or DEI workshops or talks that you've been to. So I apologize if it's feeling repetitive at this point. I think that there is no limit to how often we can reflect on our identity and how it impacts how we move through the world. So it is repetitive, yet it is important to continue to do it. So we now use intersectionality to examine how identities beyond race and gender interact. That may have been where it started and what was the foundation of it, but we should be grateful for, but are able now to use it to talk about identities beyond those two categories. So here's a visual representation of intersectionality. You could add heaps of different examples of intersections, different components of identities. If you have a component of your identity that is not being reflected here, I apologize. This is not meant to suggest that this is a comprehensive list of components of identity, but it's just enough, I think, to highlight what I'm hoping we can take away from it. So around the outside of this diagram is going to appear a series of prompting questions, and you don't need to do anything other than reflect on your answers. And then when I'm done reading them out, I'll give us a minute or two to do that reflection. Has anyone ever called you a racist slur? Are people who look like you stereotyped as dangerous or unprofessional? Does your gender identity match the one assigned at birth? Do people assume you want children? Are there representations of your relationship or relationships on film and in film and television? Can you be affectionate with your partner in public without fear of physical or verbal harm? Is your ability to stay in the country you are in precarious or dependent on work or school? Do you have a passport? Can you travel freely? Did formal schooling suit your learning style? Have you ever worried if there will be an ASL interpreter at an event or an elevator? Do your religious beliefs create precarity for you at borders? Do they make people fearful you may be violent? Do typical stat days reflect your religious days, weeks, or months of significance? Have you ever lived with food insecurity? Have you had to work throughout school to make ends meet? Has someone questioned your competencies, abilities, or your ability to lead because of your age? Has someone assumed you didn't know how to use a particular program or piece of technology? So again, I'll just give us a minute maybe to reflect on our answers to these. Okay, so the reason that I like to ask these sorts of questions or go through this particular exercise is to not only help us better understand how our own marginalized identities intersect and compound on one another, maybe, but also because while we might think we know the full extent of the privileges afforded to us by our identities when we say broad categories like gender, race, class, etc., doing this work to remind ourselves of, as I said at the beginning, the everyday implications of our identity helps us really kind of understand what our privilege is providing us with. So these questions are not, they're not like hypothetical, they are experiences that people who have these marginalized components of identity experience sometimes on a daily basis. And it's really on us to make sure that these power dynamics are intimately known so that we can call upon them all the time. So I now want to move into this, the last part of our kind of session, the last content part at least. And that's really talking about where I think intersectionality takes us as it relates to implementing it into EDI work, but really just implementing it into our lives so we can ideally cause a little bit less harm. Not saying we all cause harm, but the idea is always to cause less harm. So our identity is how we define ourselves, and that's fully for us to decide. Nobody else gets to tell us our identity. Um, we get to construct whatever that is. We get to state whatever that is. We get to be affirmed in whatever that is. Of course, though, the reality of living in a world where people hold biases is that no matter how you identify, sometimes the world will perceive you differently than you identify. And positionality is the space in between these two things. It is comprised of how you define yourself, but also of how the world defines you. So positionality has a very kind of jargony academic definition, which I'll speak to at first, but then talk about it kind of in the more real world implications. So positionality is the notion that personal values, views, and your location in both time and space influence how one understands the world. So in this context, gender, race, class, and other aspects of our identities are indicators of social and spatial positions and are not fixed given qualities or quantities. Positions act on the knowledge a person has about things, both material and abstract. And consequently, it is essential to take into account personal positions before engaging with others. Positionality is really, going back to that kind of critical theory foundation, is a critical understanding of the role a person's background and current, both socially constructed identity and perceived identity, position in the world impacts how they engage with others and how others engage with them. So it really is meant to challenge the kind of positivist construction of knowledge, the idea that uh, anybody can be objective. It refutes that idea within positivism that anybody can be objective. Instead, it highlights that the way a person is situated in space and time fosters a specific understanding of social reality. Positionality provides then a space to critically interrogate a person's motivations, assumptions, and decisions. So that is, I can acknowledge, very jargony. Essentially, what it is being aware of both who you are and how the world sees you, and any spaces in which there might be a disconnect. So an example I think that I'm super willing to talk about, because I don't want anyone else to have to tokenize or reveal components of their identity. And this is not just true for me, this is true of other non-binary people as well. I can identify as non-binary and also acknowledge that the world sees me as a man. And it is on me to understand that just because I identify one way does not mean that that is the way that the world responds to me. So if I am in a space with women or AFAB folks more broadly, they still may feel unsafe around me because I present to the world as a man, even if it's not how I identify. So my position is different than my identity in those contexts. There are many other examples of this that we can probably reflect on internally for each of you as individuals, but just a really kind of overt example of the not discrepancy, but the difference in how you identify and how the world sees you. So I want to kind of end it with this idea of positionality and identity, because intersectionality it's simultaneously this very kind of complex theoretical framework, but also this very straightforward responsibility for us as individuals. So the goal of this today was, I mean, to get us just thinking about what intersectionality is, what it looks like in practice, why we need it, and how we might be able to use it to inform our anti-oppressive work as individuals on an institutional level, on a systemic level. But on an interpersonal level, intersectionality asks of us who we are in the context of time, space, and place, and how that impacts how we see the world and how the world sees us. There's not a checklist of like, I'm successfully doing intersectionality, unfortunately. Um, Instead, if you start to observe being able to identify when bias is the driving force behind your actions, or when you build empathy for identities that are not your own and a deeper understanding of the unique experiences of those groups or individuals, that's intersectionality at play on an interpersonal level. And what that really takes is doing exercises like we just did, grappling with our own privileges and understanding how they impact our blank spots and how they result in biases that we might have. It's recognizing, this goes back to Nicole at the very beginning with her land acknowledgement about the kind of truth and history. It takes recognizing harm caused by privileged people, including ourselves now and historically. It requires us to, or asks of us to, listen to marginalized people when they articulate their experiences and really trust and believe those because they're grounded in their realities and their truths. And lastly, and maybe most importantly for those of us trying to be good advocates or co-conspirators in anti-oppressive work, it's asking of us to develop this really finely tuned, equitable lens that picks up on all injustices and imagines inclusive alternatives. So that's it. And there seems like there'll be some time for questions, which is exciting. I didn't know if there was going to be. But thank you all for giving me this space. It's like fun for me, and it's fun to engage in these conversations and have these, yeah, so I just feel very grateful. And I don't know how we want to do questions. I don't totally know how the webinar version of Zoom works. So I'm gonna leave it to Nicole to maybe start that process.
Thanks, Oakley. That was such a great talk. I always learn something new when you speak, so really appreciate it. It's got me thinking about one of the studies that we're doing, and just thinking about how we typically report like demographics of the, so it's a survey study specifically that I'm thinking of, reporting on demographics of the survey. And I'm just wondering, is there like, would it be worthwhile, would it be valuable? I've never done anything like this, to take that sort of intersectionality lens and see if different groups of people in different ways respond differently. Like consider, and I don't know if you have any resources in terms of like, has that been done before? What does that look like? What does that analysis look like?
Sorry, Jen, just quick clarification. Do you mean actually in the kind of structure of the survey and the questions themselves, or in the analysis component?
More in the analysis, yeah.
Oh, I see. Then, I mean, yes, I think that being attentive to the possible, like to the possibilities that certain marginalized intersections will experience. Well, I don't exactly know I don't know what the survey is about, but will have different experiences, I think is something that is worth pursuing. Absolutely. I think that it will allow for more, I don't know if specialized is the right word, but more impactful, specific. I don't know if intervention. I don't know necessarily what feels like the right word to describe what the data you're looking at is in pursuit of. But yes, because not all, like I think that one of the takeaways I have from trying to better understand intersectionality is that certain interventions and initiatives won't be impactful for people who exist at the intersection of identities if they're directed at, just because they're directed at the two components on their own. Like I think about this in the the need for more, or not the need, the want and desire to have more equal kind of gender representation in any particular space, but there are different barriers for different people, even if they share the same gender identity. So allowing for a more kind of intersectional approach to the analysis will then provide for more, I think, impactful. Again, I don't know if intervention is the right word in your context, Jennifer, but it will inform the most impactful, hyper-specific way to address what you're looking at, I think. Did that answer it?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
That's great. Thank you. If you know, or anyone else on this chat knows any resources to think about that, I'd really appreciate exploring this further. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Jen. Oakley, there's a question in the Q&A.
See that. I'll just read it out loud for folks. I'm wondering how we can be intimately aware of our identities and our dynamics, as you suggest, but not ask anyone to self-disclose. How do we take this approach and framework and apply it to our research teams in a professional and large team situation? Yeah, this is a really good question. It comes up, I've had this question a lot in different situations or different contexts. The like fear of people outing themselves in a workplace survey, and I totally understand why that is something we want to be really mindful of. And I don't know if I haven't really figured out the best solution yet, because I totally get balancing, ensuring that people feel seen and affirmed and like they can assert their true authentic identity, but also not requiring or even putting people in the position where they maybe feel like they need to out themselves to coworkers when they don't want to. I will say it's really hard to, it is hard to put in place long-term impactful measures if you don't know the demographic makeup of the people that you are trying to support. So a lot of transparency, a lot both around what the data will be used for, data storage, all those like ethics things that I think we're all really familiar with. But a lot of transparency around how it's going to inform intersectional, like impactful initiatives, I think in my experience has led to people being more willing to self-disclose. I mean, ideally no survey is ever required when it comes to the demographic section, especially in a workplace, but because the alternative is to homogenize marginality into a singular category, which I get feels like it and is probably objectively a safer way to do it, but it doesn't actually allow then for specialized, I guess, initiatives and or kind of being particularly attentive to certain identities, because, and I've had these conversations with people to like, I am colorblind, so if there was a question that was framed as like, do you identify as having a marginalized identity, that is technically living with a disability. But if I had no other marginalized components of my identity, to suggest that that would be a similar experience or make my navigating of the world as difficult as somebody with significantly more intersecting marginalized identities would both be untrue, but also means that you wouldn't be able to offer any kind of specialized support, I guess. So all of that kind of rambling to say is I don't think that there's a perfect answer. I think that it's really about building a lot of trust and mutual respect in the team, and so that people with marginalized identities can kind of work past that well-earned mistrust of large institutions and feel that that data and that self-disclosure is going to be respected and inform actual things that will make their experience easier. So it might be a little bit more of the survey demographic data collection in order to inform EDI work is more of a secondary step, and what is then prioritized is actually building which sounds a little ambiguous, I realize, and how do you do it, but building a culture of where there is a lot of mutual respect and celebration of different identities, because then people won't feel like they are disclosing something they don't want to share. And then my last little thing I'll say on that is that I'm cautious sometimes, and I'm not saying that this is happening in this question at all, but I'm cautious sometimes around the overcorrection of not at least making the identity categories available to people to respond to, in that it can sometimes implicitly communicate that what they are identifying as is bad. Like if you're like, well, I don't want to make them out themselves. I personally have taken that before as, well, it's because I don't actually want to know what you are, like more of that tolerance versus acceptance kind of distinction. Not saying that that's is all related, that the question is about this, but just I think additionally, another concern of homogenizing marginalization is that it's easier than to like, well, I don't have to deal with the people that make me uncomfortable. I'm just broadly saying, well, we have marginalized people here and I'm going to be attentive to that. So I realize that doesn't totally answer your question, maybe makes it more complex of anything. Sorry, yeah, of course. But that's the best that I have in this moment, because I also have not yet figured out what is the right balance between making sure people feel seen and affirmed, but also not making them out themselves.
Thanks so much, Oakley. The it depends.
Yeah.
And that's okay. So we have to sit in that. And Lori Brotto just has a question in the, Dr. Lori Brotto has a question in the Q&A, and a comment and a question.
Yes, so that, especially that the identity wheel is a very common tool in these sorts of sessions, so that sort of thing can be used no problem. And then yes, the initial kind of activity that we did, the one that's from Dr. Crenshaw's TED Talk, I mean, I didn't ask her and I use it, but I always make sure to attribute credit to her. And I can also have that sent around. I maybe should have done that beforehand because an opportunity was given me to do that, but I didn't take advantage of it. But I could maybe have that TED Talk sent around so that you can see also how she runs it, because I think that the way that she does it, that is more interactive. It's an in-person session, so there are limits to what we can do virtually. But the way that she runs it, I think, is far more impactful. So if you are ever running a session or something then in a in-person setting, I think doing it the way that she does it would be the way to do it. And so I can make sure that that gets sent around so you can see how she runs that particular activity.
Thanks so much, Oakley. Any other questions? I see many thanks, lots of gratitude. Do you have a favorite team activity to help build trust? What a great question, Lisa.
That is a really good question. I have a couple that I really like. Trying to think. So I guess it depends how small your team is and how much time you have, but just some ideas. One that I really like is it's actually taken from, it's not even, it's taken and then completely changed, but it's inspired by, which is not something that I watch, which is not a critique of people who do. I'm acknowledging that I don't watch it. It's called Hometown, and it's, I think, loosely inspired by something they do on like The Bachelor and The Bachelorette, when they literally take them to their hometowns. But this version of Hometown is essentially like a 5 to 10 minute presentation on what home means to you and how your home has informed who you are in the world. It's something that I love to do. I think it's such a fun way to get, because people can do whatever. Some people are really literal. Like, I was born here, I went to this school, and this is why I'm like this in the world. Some people take it very silly, and then some people take it really deep. And there's no real kind of guidelines on what it needs to look like, other than like, what does home mean to you and how has it impacted who you are in the world? And yeah, I think it's really wonderful. It allows you to be, oh, perfect. It allows you to be as vulnerable as you want to be in a professional setting without requiring of it. And then another one that I really like is essentially like a 5 minute convince me of something. So like a semi kind of hot take, and then you prepare a little. I like when they have like little presentations, because I think I just think it's a fun way to show up into like a trust building exercise. Where essentially you just try to convince someone of your hot take. And ideally people are not being problematic in their hot takes, but just kind of silly and funny, like pineapple on pizza, or Nickelback is actually great, or Nicolas Cage is a good actor. Like, whatever your hot take is, trying to convince someone, essentially kind of like debate style, of why what you are saying is right. And again, it's just like you learn a little bit about people, but it's a little silly, so that you're not having to, again, be too vulnerable. The Hometown one can be quite vulnerable. This one is more just fun and silly, and it's a great icebreaker for group settings.
Any other questions, folks? We've got 2 minutes. Happy to give you that time back. And I know, Oakley, I mean, I guess just very sort of practically thinking about how we can all sort of share resources and learnings as we kind of move through this work that we're all interested. Maybe we can do some thoughtful takeaway around, sharing resources, or doing a follow-up session where we can share some of our experiences.
Yeah, I would really enjoy that. There are I realize that there are a lot of resources that I put together on the hub. I don't know if everybody can access that, so I can try and maybe there's a more centralized way that we can make those available to folks. Resources, and then there's a inclusive communication guide also on the hub that has a ton of resources that accompany it, that are really broken down by kind of inclusive language around particular identity groups. But I think that it'd be worthwhile to think about how we can have more centralized resources that are not just me adding to them, because I don't know that much in the grand scheme of things. So would love if people could bring their own resources, and everyone has different lived experiences. And I undoubtedly have gaps in my knowledge because of my identity and positionality. So sorry, I'm just looking at the
Awesome.
chat.
Yeah, I think most folks in the WHRI community, as well as obviously BCCHR, have access to that hub page, but happy to promote it.
But we thank everyone for joining us today, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. There's so many thanks there in the chat, Oakley, when you get a chance to read them. And we have some hearts coming up now too. Oh, there's Nicole's empty chair. And on that note, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.